There is some background, like air noise.
That's me. Sorry, my dang AC.
Hello, welcome to our Washington Bernie-Kratz Coalition vetting interview of Jed Haney for Thurston County Commissioner, Position 3. Thank you for joining us. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be on a panel and interview with you all. So first, my name's Jed Haney. I have been active publicly for about 4 years as a cannabis activist since 2014, the legalization of recreational in Washington State. But prior to that, I was involved in medical cannabis at about 2004. Those two pathways, well, specifically medical cannabis, got me introduced to all sorts of agricultural engineering and development. And so I jumped into that and I developed a ag business, organic ag business in Yakima. And that really was an amazing experience. It was called 4 Seasons Fresh. We developed a business plan, award-winning, and that jumped me into business development. Right about the time when I won those awards, there was the legalization of cannabis in our state. And Yakima, in the city I was living in, Yakima County, in central Washington, eastern Washington, they imposed the first ban on cannabis, and it reached all the way out to medical cannabis. So that sparked me and a lot of fellow community members to gather together and start a nonprofit and to rally against those bans. Long and short of that, we ended up overturning the city ban 2 years later, and I operated that nonprofit for a few years and then merged it with what's now the state's largest trade association for cannabis businesses, called the Cannabis Alliance. And so I just kind of came out of that about last year and began my grassroots organizing back in Thurston County, where I have moved back to. I was raised up here from my late teens into my early 20s, and I find this to be a great home. And I moved back here with intentions to put my business back into place with my ag development, and also do my grassroots organizing for both cannabis rights, consumer rights, patients' rights, and also what really inspires me, which is food security and water security and environmental awareness and activism, because we have a short window to take action. And so those are the things that really inspire me. And those are a couple of the impetus points for me running for county commissioner.
Excellent. I like when you talk about agriculture and environmentalism. Are you familiar with permaculture?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, fantastic.
Are you aware of Korean natural farming or natural farming techniques?
A little bit. There was a special an event here in Tacoma that I wasn't able to make, and it was geared towards cannabis, and that's not what I'm currently farming. So it's something I want to learn more about, but there was conflict of schedule and priorities.
Yeah. So I run a lot of education, but permaculture is something I'm very familiar with. Natural farming is something that I'm running after. What I developed was aquaponics, and we took a transdisciplinary approach and developed a large greenhouse-based facility that had mycoculture, vermiculture, biogas, pretty much a transdisciplinary approach with a big footprint of a greenhouse with aquaponics in it. And I love the idea of taking trending technologies and putting them back into place, like with ideas with permaculture. What I actually do is a lot of business to business education. So at UW Tacoma, I run a series called Grow Pro, and we specialize on cannabis. Specifically, we ran a Korean natural farming series that's now growing into more of a conference, you know, and no, I'm not trying to plug that here. I'm just trying to explain that's what I do in the background, and how I maintain my activity in the community, and how I try to connect the dots between commercial activity and you know, the awareness of consumers, whether it be for cannabis or not. And I think, and I'll just end with, I think one of the most amazing things about the legalization of cannabis is that it's made us look at one specialty crop and all of the constituents around that crop, whether it be the inputs or the pesticides or any of those things. And now, you know, honestly, our cannabis on our shelves at the stores is safer than our strawberries, right? And it's something that we're going to have to look at. And I work with a group of cannabis analysis labs trying to raise standards on a state level, advocating through the regulatory agencies and through the state legislature to improve the scenario. But that's kind of what we have. We have this issue with food security. We have this long-term issue with water security, and environmental impacts are changing the way that our food's grown. And I believe in the slow food movement. I believe in acquiring our food in a 100-mile radius. I believe in slowing down money as well. I believe in, you know, building a community network around us. So these are all things that I've been working on, in the background since 2008, when we first discovered aquaponics. And it's an inspiring route to take. It's also, as I was talking with Brian earlier, it's humbling because you realize how screwed up the system is.
Does Washington have standards of what's allowed to be used on our crops? Because I am a bit of a, you know, I like organic food, so I want my herbal medicine to also be organic. And do we have some protections in place, Washington?
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic I know a lot about, so I apologize if I nerd out. So we did successfully lobby the Department of Agriculture. It was about a 2-year campaign to get the Department of Agriculture to establish a organic standard, and I put my quotation marks up because organic's actually a USDA trademark. So being a federally non-compliant crop, we can't use organic on a label. However, natural cannabis and Washington State certified natural cannabis is in the pipeline. And we are at the tail end of the rulemaking with the Department of Agriculture. So a small stakeholder group came together, and I know a few people that are in that group. It is an interesting moment where, you know, we're establishing standards for a crop that has never been, standards have never been established for. So it's in the works. What we like to see are a more fine tuning on exactly what can be applied and how it can be applied. There are a couple of radical members in that group that want it to be sun-grown only and not in a warehouse. And I kind of understand that. You know, nationally, the industry, the recorded industry, is a 1% of the national the electric grid. 1% we use. That's huge. For a pound of indoor cannabis, you could drive a Prius across the country. You know, you smoke a joint of indoor cannabis, that's like leaving a 100-watt light bulb on for 20 hours. So it's a huge impact on our environment. So I can understand how there's some that are like, no, it should only be this way. But regardless, we have a lot of voices out there. And the idea is to find that consensus inside of all those voices. So we're at the tail end of that. What you'll see is a more stringent application of organic standards in Washington State around cannabis. And then also in the pipeline are, we're foreseeing required pesticide testing It's something that's happening in California and the other legal states that are going online. It doesn't impact the consumer that much. We actually have done the metrics. We work with data folks. We work with economists, and it actually only really equates to about 4 cents a gram for all that increased testing. So it's not going to really, it shouldn't impact the consumer. In fact, it should raise the standard across the board. Yeah.
Oh, right. I have some friends that work in the cannabis industry in Oregon, and they do testing for pesticides there, which is really good to do, especially when it comes down to the concentrates, because, right? And it doesn't, and it's actually cheaper in Oregon, if I believe, than it is here in Washington. So yeah, I agree with that. But also, what do you think about, when they're talking about indoor versus outdoor? And then as we're going and trying to get more green, I'm a big advocate for hemp use for about everything there is. So I know that certain strands can't be by each other, THC versus just hemp and all of that. So that's what makes it hard to do just outdoor growth, because you have to be so far away from each other so they don't cross-pollinate. So I can see how that would be, it is a tough issue, but
yeah.
man.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up. So cannabis sativa L is the, the genus, right? And under that genus, there is policy that's, bifurcated, hemp from marijuana. And that policy says anything that's less than 0.3% THC, you can grow as hemp, right? And right now, federally compliant under Section 1706 of the U.S. Farm Bill, 2014-15 Farm Bill. So as long as you're operating under the Department of Agriculture in your state's respective program, like in Kentucky, where Senator McConnell has been pushing now in the Senate Farm Bill currently, is a federal relief from the prohibition on hemp. So that's going forward. But in our state right now, we have an IHRP, which is the Industrial Hemp Research Pilot, through the WSDA, the Department of Agriculture. And the largest crop we had last year was in eastern Washington, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Confederated Tribes, they planted 32 acres, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, and wow. Going back to the natural farming thing, Courtney, Chris Trump actually is now, who is a natural farming guru, is now reportedly he's now consulting with the tribe, because you can grow for less than a penny a gram with the natural farming technique. And when so when you're at this issue, like, why is the price so cheap, right? In Oregon, and I'm actually, excuse me, I'll stay on topic. I will get so nerded out on it. But the idea with hemp is it's also on my platform. I think that what we have to do is prepare for future crops, right?
Right.
And the idea that cross-pollination, you brought that up. Currently, our industrial hemp research pilot says that you have to have a 5-mile buffer between farms, marijuana farms and hemp farms. And that's under a research program. I think that if you're growing for seed, then that's an issue, right? Because you have to think hemp isn't all flower crops, right? It's seed, fiber, and then there's the resin crops, right? And the resin crops are actually the highest, they're the highest market value crop, right? In this current scenario. And I'm a big advocate, but unfortunately our state legislature in 2016 thought it was too much to do resin extraction. In comparison, though, you have, Senate Majority Leader Republican McConnell saying it's all good, right? So you have, it doesn't make sense really, but they were really scared of the federal interference. So they said no resin extraction in our state. So right now we're a seed and fiber state only. What that means is a lot of infrastructure. There are a couple of loopholes that try to stitch the industries together. They didn't really work that well. And right now, currently, the marijuana industry is buying CBD from other states and other nations, including China, while we could be producing it here at home and even exporting it. So to kind of sum up, I position myself in this long-term planning, approach with the industry. I think as a breadbasket state, we could be prepared to be a large exporter of hemp and other cannabis products. And we do currently. If you look at hops, which is in the genus of Cannabaceae, right, or Cannabaceae, you think about there's cannabis sativa, cannabis humulus lupus, right? Cannabaceae, humulus lupus is hops. And we talked about cannabis. So hops right now is actually produced in Yakima County, particularly 76% of the nation's hops are produced in that county. That's a big deal, right? And so what it is it's an industry that put a footprint down and acquired a certain aesthetic, and it's now consumed in mass. And I think that we could be there with hemp, right? We could be there with lots of different genetic varieties. Some people say, oh, the Northwest can't do that. Well, there are things like autoflowers that have 120-day, crop rotation. We could get 2 autoflower rotations in our Thurston County environment, and then be prepared to export it right into the Sound and right out into some other industrial stream. I think it's really a viable solution. So I've talked about it a few times. I talked about it to the county commissioners the first time I went and advocated for some of the zoning that they were applying to the industry, the marijuana industry. And I cautioned, I said, what you're doing right now to this crop also has implications on this other crop. And then also we have an clean air, the Olympic Clean Air Agency, and they were trying to basically regulate the marijuana industry. And I said, do you guys realize what you're regulating? And they kind of didn't really understand. And I tried to explain to them, you're trying to regulate a smell, and a smell isn't a cannabinoid. A smell is not THC. It's not CBD. A smell is a terpene. A smell is a volatile compound. And I asked them, how many lavender farms do you regulate? And they said, none. Well, then don't regulate this, because that's exactly it. Linalool is a lavender terpene, which is very common with, cannabis. So I tried to explain that to them. I think they wrap their heads around it, but, basically these different agencies have been treating this new crop, this new industry for our state. We're a right to farm state. We're right to farm counties. They're treating us as a pariah, and it's unnecessary, and it's chasing us around. And the Thurston County Commissioners particularly imposed a zoning restriction that said that any new farm would have to purchase a minimum of 50 acres and have a 500-foot setback from any said property boundary. And then the state, required, 8-foot fence and all of the security and everything else, right? So they're imposing these extra restrictions. What does that mean? That means a small farmer has to buy 50 acres to farm a quarter of an acre. That does not make sense, right? And it's just, that's one of the impasses that I have with my current county commissioners, that they don't seem to be very connected with what's happening around them, what's happening at a state level, because I've been working on these zoning issues at a state level, and what is even happening on a federal level with like hemp. So anyway, I would like to see Thurston County be in a viable position for future crops, including hemp.
Oh, yeah, I love it. We did a great big chunk of that, so I love your views on that. We definitely all agree, because we've had this conversation, so I can say we all totally agree with what you said. To get to kind of the nitty gritty, how are you financing your race? What kind of donors are you looking at trying to bring in and or accept donations from? Do you have any?
So I'm branding myself as the People's Independent. I'm running as an independent. I decided to run as an independent for a lot of reasons, but I won't talk about those right now. I'll talk about mainly the idea of what does it mean to be an independent, and especially in an environment where party politics rule the game. So I am not taking any corporate donations. I am not taking any PAC donations. I haven't followed through with a bunch of PAC endorsement process because I have that stance. I've petitioned my community for support. I have to take ownership for the fact that it took me a long time to get that donation platform put up and together. So I think that impacted my campaign, especially be a late runner. But I learned a lot in the process. So I'm still continuing to petition my community for support. The end of the day, we want to show that there is voter apathy in Washington State, particularly in Thurston County as well, because they're dissatisfied with the party options that are being placed. And our county commissioners are three independents strong. It's really a really interesting thing when you look at it because they're all Republicans. They're all past Republicans supported by Republican Party and Republican elites. And it's not okay that they get to go up there and run as independents just to, as a cloak. And in Thurston County just has a historical record of not voting Republican. However, there's a trend of independence, and I think tapping into that both from a fundraising perspective and a get out the vote perspective is what my campaign's about. It's about noting that there's voter apathy because they're not satisfied, and it's about not playing into that game because that's the way the game is played.
Right. Is this your first time running for any office?
Yes, this is my first campaign. I've been around many other campaigns. I have been toying with the idea of candidacy for a while. And I made this decision as a decision to get in, learn, to make my points clear. I would love to see a progressive Democratic voice in the commissioners. I would also like to see a dilution of the commissioners to see a county council as opposed to a county commission, something that I've also been working on before this whole run. So I've been looking at the county politics for a while, but specifically, the intent is to make the current incumbent, Bud Blake, who is an independent, identify what type of independent he is. And thus far, it has worked. So I've self-funded my campaign with a small support of the community. And in the efforts, it's made Bud Blake say, I'm a centrist independent. So he's now identifying that he is working with the Republicans. And, it's interesting. You see his name with also Tim Sheldon. I don't know if you guys are aware of Sheldon. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting moment, right? Where voter trends in Washington State show that there's a dissatisfaction with party politics, and there are sly politicians out there taking advantage of that. And so my intent is to change the dialogue around that.
Wonderful. One of the things I addressed before I get to Courtney, we're going to go through a list with you, but is I'm with the Represent Us. Nationally, I am a coalition coordinator in our local group here, and we work on the American Anti-Corruption Act. It's a national platform, but we actually bring it local, and it's about really teaching and getting our local politics to be ethical, right? To kind of teach at the local level to hopefully garner as they go, everybody moves up. It's about, transparency, election reform, getting money out of politics. So we do ask people to go to there, take a look at it, and endorse it if it's something that you're behind. And it sounds like you would be one to do that. So I encourage you to take that look. What do you think about public elections, publicly funded elections, and then maybe setting a certain time frame, or the two-party system? What do you think about our two-party system here? Do you like the idea of ranked choice voting or a scored voting system? What's your ideas on those?
So let's start back to My idea with ending corruption in politics, I 100% endorse and agree with that. On a local level, it's important because the nod of party politics impacts decisions on a local level. There isn't per se caucuses or things of that nature, committees that you need to sway, but at a local level, you see a lot of, especially like when I was in Eastern Washington, you see a lot of like, well, the federal government says this, or, you know, and then we went into the Trump era and it was even worse, right? And so it's like, so I definitely agree with that because it stems down. But I'm also an advocate of getting involved at a local level. So party politics really start impacting at county level. I think that we should really strip away, I think, where party politics aren't necessary. We should strip that away, and we should make avenues for third party potentials. I personally, I am a Bernie-crat. I caucused for Bernie at county, at my precinct and up to county when I was in King County. I am proud about that. You know, I think that it was an eye-opening experience for me as you know, new into politics and into the arena. And I think a lot of Bernie-crats, you know, had that experience. So I've been saying since that moment, you know, we could be dismayed about the federal issues and the national scene, but at a local level, it's very important that we storm and that we flood these seats and these positions because of the statements I made earlier. And so after I watched what happened with Bernie, I did vote third party. I voted for Jill. I want to see a third party established in this state and nationally. And I'd like to see more than just a third. And then that's going into ranked choice voting or scored voting. I'm a big proponent for that. For specifically, ranked choice makes sense to me. I like the idea of being able to put multiple choices out there and allow that voter voice to continue. This isn't football. You know, we shouldn't be having the Super Bowl of politics every year or every 4 years or whatever, right? And then all of the regalia that went with the team, you know, like, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm not a football fan per se, but I'm saying I've watched it.
Yep.
And I just think that that's horrible. So also to your point about the length of campaign, right? We don't need to campaign for years. We don't need to campaign for 6 months, right? The voters are actually worn down by this whole process, right? And then you have these robocalls. And I mean, you guys, I don't know if you all have run, but as soon as you put a campaign inbox out there, it is flooded with all of this commercial activity for robocalls and all of the things that they want. They say, you know, wins a campaign. There is a commercial activity around campaigning, and that's the point that I'm making. And
yes, there is.
Yeah, we should remove that. And also, you know, the thing that I said to my staff, which is very thin. In fact, I only have a staff of one, and she's amazing. Sarah Hansen, you know, she's...
Oh, Sarah, yes, she is very, I see her, yes. I love watching Sarah out in social media land.
She's great. She's a big reason why I ran. Sarah and I worked together, and she kind of talked me into it, which is good, right?
It is good.
Like I said, I've been toying with the idea for a long time. And so... but in any event, you know, the things that I wanted to establish in my campaign, if, you know, especially if we were to really go forward, and I'm humble in the idea of where I'm at with my campaign in comparison to the other campaigns. And so I won't flaunt the idea that I'm going to acquire the 5,000 votes that it's going to take to get me past the primary, because I don't think that I will get it. But that's okay. I think that the idea is to make the statement that I've expressed before and to work with my staff. Now, if I was to go forward and I were to take on the donation metrics that I proposed, which was about 27,000 in the primary and 42,000 for the general. And I'm nowhere near that. But if I were to get to that, I wanted to pay my staff particularly $15 an hour.
Yep.
And whatever my campaign couldn't muster, I wanted to make sure that we have reflected that as trade in kind, because I think there's a big issue inside of campaigns. And I know that was very winded to get to that whole point. But the issue is that campaigns take a lot of energy. And unfortunately, it's the staffers that take the brunt of that. And it's the unspoken or unheard of issue inside and around campaigns. So I wanted that to be also a statement inside my campaign. I'm a little dismayed that I didn't get to that level of making that statement, but I will continue to practice my political exercise inside of Thurston County, and we'll see. It's not the primary yet. I'll see where I get with my votes, and my support team is around me, and we're all, hopeful. But the idea is that, going back to your point, campaigns are really rigged in the wrong way. They're not rigged for the people. And the voices that get dominant in that campaign are the PACs or the different groups or the different donors that you try to entice into it. And that changes your platform and it changes who you respond to. And that shouldn't be. So shorten the time, make sure that it's not a burden on all this community to lift a candidate up and whatnot.
Awesome, thank you. So Courtney has started doing this a while back, and I love this section. It's a bunch of just we're going to ask you. Actually, I'll let her explain it to you because I keep trying to do that and I don't do well. So Courtney, go ahead and take over.
Well, we have a list here. We just kind of bounce through them pretty fast. It's about services that we want to know if you think they should be in the public sector, so socialized, provided via the government agencies, or privatized and offered through private services. And of course, there are some that we accept answer. Well, we accept your answers, but having a combination, I think that's a combo private public, that's well within acceptable. So we'll start with an easy one, healthcare.
Well, yeah, I think that we have historical evidence that shows that privatized healthcare has not worked. So I fully supported I-1600, and I fully support healthcare for all. It is a right.
Excellent, thank you. Postal service.
Well, geez, I would not want to see that go public or private, excuse me. I'd like to see it improved even. It's a public service and it needs to maintain.
Excellent. Schools.
Now, I am not a fan of privatized schools. However, I am a fan of dynamic schooling environments. So I am a product of a hybrid schooling experience because I had a split family home. Our family chose to go with an accredited program through a California homeschooling program. So I have the experience of going through traditional school and homeschooling. So I think that we should maintain an understanding that a dynamic schooling environment is necessary for a lot of different reasons. It really worked well for our family. So, and myself, I feel like I got a very valuable and for a state education, a public education, it was I think in some ways better. But in any event, the swing that we have towards charter schools and the atrocities that we see towards the rights of certain individuals, especially people of color, in that charter school system is not to be endorsed.
Excellent. And I like homeschooling as well. I'd have done it myself if I'd had the resources.
Right.
So prisons?
Oh gosh, no. Especially as an advocate for the drug war and ending the drug war, The idea that individuals are still in even our local county jails for dealing with the drug convictions, especially nonviolent. We need to get them out. We need to treat drug issues as they are. It's a mental health crisis. It's a public health crisis. It's not something to be making money off of. So we need to shut down the privatized prison system. It's a human rights crisis that is not talked about in enough ways.
Excellent. And then Social Security, the distribution and management of it.
Unfortunately, Social Security, it's just not been managed, and folks like us will not see the promises that Social Security were laid out, that Social Security was to be as it was laid out in front of us. So we need to find, again, I'll use the word dynamic solutions to shore up the Social Security system and repair it so it is the promise that was made out for all generations, not just to be. Unfortunately, it's only going to benefit the baby boomers as it sees. Right now, we have an expiration of 40 years minus on Social Security system. So if it's to be maintained, I personally, and not to go off, but I think that universal basic income is something to be talked about right now.
We're getting there.
Oh, excuse me, sorry.
You're jumping the gun here, mister.
That's one of the ones we're going to talk about.
Yeah, well, close to it, anywho. But with Social Security, would you support or advocate for or against, say, instead of having Social Security as it is now, even as flawed as it is, or would you like privatize? Like some people discuss putting Social Security into 401ks or letters and numbers I don't have off the top of my head, but that kind of scenario.
Gosh, no. Over and over again, we see money mismanagement at the top, right? And I personally do not see a lot of follow through with the Fed. Right? There's a lot of squawk, but not a lot of walk, right? And so, no, I do not want to see our public funds, being squandered and taken offshore specifically. So, no, public all the way. I'm a big proponent for public ownership and public engagement in that ownership process.
Excellent. Okay, and foster care?
Foster care should not be privatized. It should remain a public. The thing with privatization is we lose transparency. And this is something I deal with constantly, people working around rules to try to benefit themselves. Anytime you offer an incentive of money for someone for any service, whether it has to do with a child or a widget, they're going to find a way to work around and make more money. So, gosh, no. Absolutely.
Childcare then?
Childcare is really important to offer public services because childcare is a community service, and it should be looked at that way. Again, going to the idea that we need to have a workforce out there that is responsive to the really quickening that's happening. We're in a post-capitalism, post-industrialism era where labor is a commodity, and including the labor that it takes to care for a child, right? And so if we want equal care, especially for early childhood learning, we should be offering public service at the age of even 2, because that's where it's shown in science that early learning really establishes. And if we want mature adults that have great decision-making powers and the best, lead towards a great successful life, we should be offering at that in the earliest stage possible.
Well, this is so awesome. I'm just going to move the basic income stuff up to here when it comes to childcare. And with their studies, I do agree that the studies show that early childhood intervention can help long term, but it also is based on an economic status, because those in and a higher economic status often have a stay-at-home parent. And then, so it's not just that school at 2 years old is better, it's that intervention in those early years are better. And some of that can be done at home. And if the home isn't available, then we need to do it as a public service. And so jumping from that to, so there's been some discussion about universal basic income, UBIs, in our groups. And we've also heard that there's some people on the right who want to dismantle our social security net and replace all of the current social services with a UBI, but at a much greater reduced amount. And so some people are getting shy about discussing UBIs because there's the good version and the bad version, and we're worried about the vocabulary being usurped by the bad version. But and then some people are just not going to be fans of UBIs. So we've talked about something called a caregiver's basic income, and that is like a bridge or a stepping stone maybe to a positive UBI. And roughly, it's not written out in policy yet, but as a rough idea, it's if you're raising a child or children under the age of 8, if you're caring for someone who's disabled or who's aging, that you shouldn't have to also work a job or a second job while juggling those caregiving services, and that so you should get a basic income, and that it should go to your Social Security credit as well, because currently people who take time off to raise a family or care for a family member, those years are not earning any Social Security benefits. So how does that idea sound to you?
Yeah, I like the idea. I like the idea of a non-cookie cutter approach because it can be changed, especially in messaging, to fit the agenda of certain folks. I see that. I hadn't really thought so much about that because I guess I don't listen to the pulse of that right-wing perspective so much, but I could see the erosion of the platform of UBI. So I like the idea of talking about, especially with a caregiver income, because it really talks about what does it take to take care of somebody and to be an active, supportive member of the society. People don't get that, once it starts slipping the other way, it becomes an impact on all of us, right? No matter how much income you make, you're a taxpayer, you're buying goods, your money is put into this pool. And as soon as somebody slips off that edge, that's an impact on that common pool. And so I think that we have to talk about where that edge is and why that edge is, right? Mm-hmm. And it takes 72 plus hours a week for a minimum wage earner to even afford rent in this state right now. So the idea that you can now impose, care for a family member or, in the unfortunate, scenario of someone that's sick or ill, or, that's impossible. I currently have some friends in the medical cannabis community that deal with this on a daily basis, and it pulls at my heartstrings. And the fact that they don't have, care coverage, they don't have the ability to have, employment coverage, why they have to go, to deal with a crisis. And these are impacts that hit us on a daily basis. And so, I agree with that, right? We shouldn't see GoFundMes having to be set up, right? And if we see these in mass, then it's a sign. It's a sign that there's a need.
I tell everybody to go and just type in medical care in GoFundMe land, and it's insane. It's insane the number of people out there.
Yep. All right. Back to our list.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. I know it was so good. So the next one is utilities: electric, water, trash and recycling, all the good things that we often pay private companies to do within our cities.
Public. So specifically with trash, right? So like management of that and the environmental impacts of that trash management and that waste management is very important. When it's private, it's a group of shareholders or a couple of people on a board making decisions, usually short-sighted decisions that aren't thinking about the long-term impacts. Those folks maybe not even live in this area or the state or even in the country, right? As soon as we go privatize, we go open up the door for private ownership from out of country. That's scary. I see it in the cannabis sector, even though we're supposed to have, these restrictions for ownership for a specific crop, right? And so you would say, well, the federal government's really concerned about this, so the state would probably be doing a really good job at maintaining this. That's not the case at all. Ownership is all over the place, and it's hard for the state to maintain, awareness of that and to maintain like a watchdog approach. So so what we have currently in our government is complaint-driven systems generally. And then those get bogged down and there's not enough people to deal with them. So could you imagine I couldn't. I don't want to imagine that. So no, public all the way. Let's get it back to public. We have public utility districts in Washington State that work really well.
Tacoma.
Yeah, right? Right? And, and the idea is as soon as that power hits the grid of the public, it's the public's power. Right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter where that power came from. As soon as it hits our grid, it's the public's. That's the very important factor there, especially as we're going into an era of limited resources.
Yeah. Okay. So then what about internet and cell service?
Yeah, for sure. Cell service is an interesting one, but it's such a required part of being an active member of society. Right? Like that's what somebody needs to get off the streets is a phone and an address, right? That's really important factor to look at. So we need to look at these basic rights because they're basic requirements of being a basic human in our society. So yeah, I would like to see some sort of, it doesn't have to be a smartphone per se. Those things are faster than my first computer. It could be a flip phone. I mean, so what do they call us? Xennials, where, you remember the analog, but then we went into digital era. I was born in 82. So I remember some of the throwback stuff, but, I didn't have a pager. I remember pagers. My first phone was a flip phone and it barely texted, did a text. So, I mean, how hard would it be to offer that? I don't think it would be very hard. And I do work with, so I do some community service. I just finished my DJ training with a local community radio station, and community operations work, right? Like you get a community together. There's like, I think over 120 DJ volunteers. There's not that many shows, obviously, but there's that many people on hand and on staff to help out, right? And so the thing runs 24/7, 365. And it works and it connects the community. So it's not that far-fetched to think that a community can come together and help each other.
Absolutely. Okay. What about public lands and natural resources?
They're the public's. In fact, they're not even ours. They belong to the indigenous people. And before that, they belong to the earth. So, I mean, realistically, they should remain public and we should acquire them and command more of those lands, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things as a county commissioner, it's long-term zoning and planning, right? And my thing is affordable housing on my platform. How are we going to incentivize affordable housing when we're looking at 100,000+ individuals coming into our county in the next 20 to 40 years? 16,000 of that's going to be in the rural area. Predominant amount of my district is rural. So we have to look at where are those developments going to go? What are they going to look like? And what type of services are going to be intrinsically stitched into those developments? How are we going to incentivize a developer, or how are we going to maintain our rights during that development process? And those are some of the things that I'm really talking about.
Excellent. And then banks.
We need a state bank, and I love community credit unions. I think that at a local level, it would be great to see community banks come together. It's not that hard, far-fetched, again, to think of our wealth being more secure at a local level. I brought up slow money earlier. The
Yeah.
idea of slow money is, again, acquiring money within 100-mile radius of whatever project you're working on. And that's a big part of my ethos. I think that, that money impacts and the activity around that money impacts the entire community in a much more generative way. So I would love to see community cooperatives come together, establish community banks through those cooperatives, see more community credit unions run, a state bank be established, our people's money being in a more secure bioregional place than
Thank you for saying bioregion.
yeah, it's right behind me. It's not just a pretty color scheme. It's an idea, right? And I think that we're all akin to that on this panel. But I'll just throw my statements out there that we're much safer if we all look at each other in a bioregional way and perspective. And again, that slow money, that slow food. We, as Cascadia, we are an independent region. We don't necessarily need all of the things that are being imported, and we're safe from a lot of the impacts that, even environmental earth changes are happening. So we're pretty lucky. We have to be prepared to support our communities as they stand and for the influx of people that are going to come because we have such a precious gem. So we have to protect it. We have to be prepared. And I think we can do it. I think that, like I was talking about the breadbasket, over in Eastern Washington, we have some of the nation's most valuable farmland because we've established irrigation. Now, I know that's impacted the environment in a lot of ways, but the infrastructure's there. So we might as well utilize it, and we might as well make sure that while we're utilizing it, we're repairing, restoring what we can, and taking care of our resources. But as a bioregion, that breadbasket could support us, is what I'm getting at, right? We don't have to export those things. They could be in our area. Again, with Thurston County, we're a mighty rural area. We don't have a lot of rural access to goods. So farmers markets are on my platform as well to expand farmers markets through public development authorities, which is a public ownership interface with your community, like your county funds specifically. So
excellent. Thank you. And then mass transit, from buses to ferries, railways, and airways.
Yeah, so it's really important. It's crazy to think that when a shopping center is developed, that for every 100 square feet, there's 4 car parking stalls required, right? I think that's the metric. I may be a little off there. But the idea is that, our cities and our shopping centers are designed around cars, not people. That's really weird. And it's not a very effective way to use our resources and the impacts of those resources. One of the things that I appreciated about my time in King County was my close accessibility to the light rail. And that got me from my residence into the city and within 20, 30 minutes and back and forth. And in fact, I didn't have to sit into traffic. I didn't have to deal with the impacts of having the carbon emissions. So it makes sense to have that accessible, but that's the idea. It has to be accessible. Any solution that's offered has to be accessible. So I know that there's some conspiracy theories around like how the Detroit motor industry really, foiled the plans of bus and trolleys and these other things. And I've looked into that a little bit, and I know it's not really full conspiracy. I guess I just kind of paint it that way because, who's to really know? It's history, right? But the idea is that we had a moment in our development of our suburban and urban planning where we were putting these things in place. We were putting mass transit options in place. So I think that we need to get back to that moment. We need to be in a place where we're thinking ahead. How are these people going to get, how are these 16,000 people in rural Thurston County going to get into Olympia, where there's now 80,000 more people, you know, in Olympia area, right? And so these are things we have to talk about, especially with transit.
Absolutely. And then infrastructure.
Infrastructure, again, public ownership is really important to make sure that the standards are long-term, that, you know, when you have a decision to use certain, a certain development practice, for example, a construction practice, that it's not done for a short-term gain, it's done for a long-term benefit. So we need to just really stitch that together. So if a bridge falls, it shuts down I-5, it shuts down your ability to get to work, it shuts down your ability to, you know, have a safe experience on public motorways, right? So we need to flip the script from commercially driven improvements to publicly driven improvements.
Nice. And then the military and its associated industrial complex.
Garbage, all of it.
Publicly or privately funded.
Right. Oh, sorry. That's right.
Okay.
I forgot.
It's okay.
No, I just think
I like your
answer.
Sorry, I'm on mute and I'm just chuckling back here. I love doing like, oh, it's all just bad.
It's pretty bad. But so like I have family that works at Boeing, and I get it, right? I get that that's a part of, you know, the income stream. I get that. I cannot go. It should. So, okay, why do we have a standing army, right? So let's go back to like, why do we have a standing army, you know? And I think that if we can frame it in those specific ways, then it makes sense to reduce our standing army back down to where it's required by our Constitution to have a defense, but it doesn't have to be expanded to this point. So we're inflated. It's a bubble, right? And as every bubble works, it pops and things fall off, and then it gets inflated again, right? So we need to get off of that roller coaster, you know, establish our defenses where they need to be, establish our offenses. Unfortunately, that's a statement that has to be made, but that's real world because there's a lot of bad people out there. So establish those where they need to be. But we live in an area in Washington State where we have like JBLM and we have all of the Navy activity. Like, this is huge, right? This is, in my opinion, a big bullseye, right? Like, why do we need that, you know? So we need to disperse that. It used to be, there was a time when it wasn't consolidated. And there was a time when these small little micro bases actually supported the communities that they're around. Like, there is economy around the military, and I'm not anti-military servicemen and women. In fact, I'm pro-veteran. There's an unfortunate circumstance when there is as many wartime veterans as we've had when we haven't actually been in war. That's just where we're at, right? But thank you for every wartime veteran and non-wartime veteran for your service, because it's a necessary function of our society to maintain the framework that we've all come to expect.
Yeah, there is definitely a separation between military decisions of our government and those who we send to enact those decisions. Absolutely. And then, so the Veterans Administration, public or private?
Oh yeah, so I didn't realize that's a great segue. I mean, it has to maintain public, because privatization allows, you know, more negative failed FDA trial drugs to go to our veterans, right? That's a real statement. Veterans are offered the workaround through the FDA. Failed drug trials get packaged up, and instead of a veteran getting offered one bottle, they're offered 3 or 6 bottles, right? Each bottle comes with a side effect. So now imagine the compound, effect that has. And I know veterans, I've worked with them, especially around PTSD and TBI. We got that added in 2015 as a qualifying condition for medical cannabis in Washington State. So it's really important to look at these other solutions, right? If you can take away 28 pills with one, herbal solution, right? Then that should be a viable option. And there should be a public voice in that option. If it was private, then they would say, no, we don't make enough money off of that option, which is really the case. So we need to maintain this public engagement, this public voice in it, because the public knows best. And if the person in that position isn't responding, then the public has a way to reach up and touch that issue.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And then scientific funding.
I talked about football earlier, and I made a little joke around it. But the reality is like, imagine a world where our scientists were paid what our football stars are. And no offense to any football star or any other sports star, but just imagine that. Mm-hmm. Imagine when these scientific advancements were there was an explosion of excitement around quantum physics revelations, right? Where we're finally understanding the framework of our universe, and we're able to tap into, this is the idea. We're one scientific advancement away from energy independence. We're one scientific advancement away from removing all hydroelectric dams, taking away every nuclear, facility, removing every coal, and that's the issue, right? Because every advancement takes away the old established, privatized industries and how they're making money. So that's why there's this big tug of war. So yeah, imagine that. And I think that in a publicly driven system, you have your flaws, but again, you have the ability for the public to get involved and have their voice heard, right, and changed.
Yeah. Excellent. Space exploration. A publicly funded.
Yeah. So like privatization has accelerated space exploration, but that's because NASA has been unfunded.
Yes.
So like exciting times, Elon Musk gets to have a new PR cred, but and I'm no offense against Elon Musk. I'm not trying to be his buddy per se. I'm just saying, like, I'm sure it takes a lot to jump off that cliff and to launch a rocket into space. That's a lot. But the idea is that we already had a public institution, but that public institution wasn't funded like our military. Imagine if the lost money that the Pentagon loses annually, right, which is in the trillions, I'm sure. I don't know the exact number, but I just read a report where they lost a couple $100 billion, and it's like, oh, we don't know where that went. Well, imagine if that went to NASA. Imagine if that went to another public service. And why aren't we holding our military public service accountable? Sorry to digress there, but that's the idea, right?
Yeah. Excellent. And libraries?
Public all the way. Yeah, we didn't have libraries, until like the mid 70s in Thurston County, right? The Timberland library system was put together, I think, in the 78, 76. It was mid to late 70s, excuse me. I was just listening to Senator Karen Frazier talk about her experience as a public servant. It was really, really eye-opening. She was one of the first women in the legislature as a legislative assistant, and then she went into Lacey as a councilwoman, mayor, and then into the county, and then back up to the state legislature, eventually senator. As a woman in an era when it's just not heard of, right? So she brought in some of the things that she brought in was the public library system, the Timberland Regional Library System. If it wasn't for somebody like Karen Frazier and her supporters and other fellow citizens that were involved in that process, then we wouldn't have what we have today in Thurston County and the area around Thurston County as the Timberland Regional Library System. It's a gem. It's cherished. My girlfriend's son just got out of kindergarten recently, and then one of the first things we did is we went to the library and got a big stack of books so that we can continue that educational experience. Nice. So public all the way.
Excellent. And then all over the state, we're seeing housing crises. And in Tacoma, the group of people I've been chatting with, they're disproportionately realtors. And they're talking about how to solve the housing crisis. And there was discussion about, should realtors be in on this discussion? And they asked, well, why not? And so my reply was, I don't know that I want any solutions offered by people who might make profit off of the solutions, because I'll feel that there's too great a risk that those solutions aren't optimized, because instead it's optimizing profit. So how do you feel about community housing, privatized or public funding?
Well, I think that, yeah, so I mean, housing is a really important factor. We are the most, like, historically the most wealthiest country, yet there are people on our streets. You know, it doesn't take much to convert housing or property that's being bought and acquired for a long-term investment into some sort of public service and offer some sort of incentive to do that, right? There's a gamble with property investment and acquiring that. So I think that what we have to do is first address the issue, and how we address that issue is there's, I'm sure, multiple ways to approach this. But ownership, giving somebody an address and establishing some sort of equity value for that ownership at an earliest stage possible is really necessary. That's the way that our system works. So down in Salem, Oregon, there is a tiny home community that has been established to transition individuals off of the street that are homeless and into some sort of ownership scenario. A tiny home is it's a term for, you know, a structure that's generally around 100 square feet or so, but a tiny home it could be used in so many ways, right? And the county owns property, the port authorities own property, right? The state owns property. There's property all over the place, and including Weyerhaeuser, which is the largest private owner of land in Washington state, that is just sitting there, and we need to command that property into a public service, right? If it's owned by especially the county and the subsequent public agencies or governments, excuse me, we should definitely have the ability to put an infrastructure of support. So tiny homes, I'd love to see on county property some sort of tiny home established, that tiny home being able to be movable, right? Where an individual could acquire this home, improve the home, pay for the home, that home becomes their home, they can move that home onto a property, right? And then we establish zoning variations that give the ability to plop a tiny home on somebody's, 5-acre parcel, and as long as it doesn't impact, their septic system, for example, right? It has to be able to maintain with these environmental factors. But there are ways where we can transition, from a public into an individual, from a public space where community comes together into a private space.
Excellent. And elections.
Oh gosh, publicly funded elections would be an interesting thing. I've looked into it a little bit, so I'm not an expert. I'll have to just start with that. But imagine a day when our money was used appropriately. Elections were a shorter cycle, and then individuals could petition a small pool or a smaller pool, right? Instead of petitioning, again, these donors from all over the place. Why would a donor from Seattle or from Spokane or from elsewhere, even internationally, care about what's happening in Thurston County? Well, I think that because they have an agenda, usually with their money. It's not all nefarious. There are some good players out there that are being supported. But imagine if that now that person doesn't have to live in that area, right? Their money went into that area to support an agenda, but they don't have to live and you know, to deal with the impacts of that sway in that process. So public would be an interesting solution, especially as a grassroots self-funded campaign. I could see that as a great solution.
Excellent. Excellent. And then first responders, should we privatize them?
Gosh, no.
Okay.
No, yeah. But I mean, I'm sure there's space for privatization in first response, but the variability that you would get if everything was privatized would be unnecessary. It would be actually, I think, a public safety issue, right? Who's to say that somebody in charge of a private corporation company is you know, there appropriately? How did they get there? Are they managing the funds appropriately? Now, if there's a mismanagement, when you pick up the phone, is there going to be somebody to receive your call? When they dispatch that call, is there going to be somebody to do that? In a public process, we have transparency, we have checks and balances. And so I would like to maintain that and expand that.
Excellent. And then would you support legal services for those who are economically depressed? So kind of like public defenders at a greater scale. So say divorce, not everybody can afford a divorce attorney, but everybody should have one.
Yeah, well.
Everybody should have a divorce?
No, lawyer. Or their divorce.
That's funny. What's the statistic? Every day, an average citizen offends 111 laws or something like that. It's ridiculous. There are so many laws in place, and then as good as we would want our judicial system to operate, it's obviously not the best. So yeah, we need to expand public defense. We need to put. I like that there's in Washington State, there's like the Washington Law Center. It's a nonprofit that helps individuals with legal issues. So there is some nonprofit activity, but why does that nonprofit activity have to exist? Is it because the system in place is too complex and there's not enough support structure? And I would nod to yes. So why do we have a public system that is putting the public in harm? That doesn't make sense. So yeah, we need to support the public as much as possible.
Well, excellent. And that wraps up that list.
That was a great list. Thank you for those questions.
It was cultivated from the Washington Bernie-Kratz Coalition Facebook group. There was some light discussion about services that people thought should be public services. And so I kind of made a list of 7 things off the top of my head and then just kind of put it out there for the rest of the group to add. And this is what's come of it. Great.
It's excellent.
All right, so we're over an hour now. Oh, so sorry for talking over you. So I guess I want to give Brian an opportunity to ask any questions that he's
I have been just
on.
patiently waiting and taking all this in. Oh man, this is great. That is probably the best explanation of our list. Like you literally, I was looking at your website, you're just hitting all your points through our list, and it's beautiful. So thank you for that. Some quick things that I wanted to ask you were, you have criminal justice reform. What sort of criminal justice reform are you referring to, and how would you go about doing that?
Excellent. That's a great question. Thank you. So right now in Thurston County, we have a predominant amount of our budget going to the criminal justice system. That's everything from the law side, so the legal side, excuse me, all the way to the first responders. So leaning that up is really necessary. So there's a couple of programs that have been put in place by the defenders by the prosecutors that are supposed to streamline the defense up. So there's a lead system that has not been really implemented, and it's not as robust as it should be. So as a commissioner, budget is a big issue under, and budget management is a big issue under the commissioner's role and responsibility. So working with the prosecutor's office and making sure that we have the most lean system possible that is actually working, right? Again, a lot of squawk, not a lot of talk. And I think when you have these party-driven positions, then you have this, this potential where, the prosecutor made a lot of talk during an election year, got something in place, but didn't actually engage it. So that's the type of reform, is going in, looking what's in place, talking to the staff, not trying to reinvent the wheel, but making sure that the systems that are in place are effectively working. And then a subset under that reform is cannabis record expungement, so nonviolent criminal release.
I was just looking at that on your site too. I love the way that you put that up there. And I'm actually in that breadbasket that you were talking about. I recently just moved to Moses Lake. So maybe even after this and in the future, I'd love to connect to you further and what happenings are going on around here and what improvements can be made with the hemp and cannabis and all of the farming techniques and like what you're into. Oh man, I can listen to you all day talk about that stuff.
It's pretty exciting. Yeah, well, and think about the impact. So our criminal justice system, specifically around cannabis, has impacted people of color primarily. We need to go through and fix that as much as possible. So that's the biggest one. I think another factor under, and it's not a priority point in my platform, but again, it goes back to criminal justice reform and cannabis record expungement. Folks that are using drugs because of a mental health issue or a physical health issue. There's something wrong, right?
I have hemophilia, and it is the one thing that I can go to that will always help me, no matter what.
Yeah. So what we have to do is this drug war approach, which is filled our prison system, which is, is overloaded the defender's office, the public defender's office and the prosecutor's office. Meanwhile, there's violent crimes happening. There are crimes in our community that are happening. And these are being overlooked. And so those are the type of reforms that I'm talking about.
Beautiful. Thank you for that.
For sure.
I don't really have anything else. You did great. Thank you for coming and doing this interview with us. It's been a real eye-opener, and I hope you do well. And I love your, real quick, I'm into graphics and stuff, so I like your emblem that you have on your website, because the little swooshes, I know what they stand for.
All right. So thank you for noting that. They're totally a throw to Bernie.
Yep.
Yeah, I have to, my graphic designer, David Morgan, and I have known each other since Pasco, and he actually is a retail cannabis shop owner. And I've been working with him, trying to help him overcome the bans since 2014. He now lives in Spokane, so he helped me out with my graphics. So thank you, David Morgan. Versatile Designs.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I just wanted to throw one more thing is I'm such a fan of public ownership. I talked about public development authorities or farmers markets. I think that we should have cannabis stores also publicly owned. There's a model in North Bonneville in Skamania County that's operating. It's a local store owned by the city of North Bonneville through a public development authority. And it's currently making the city of 1,000 people over $100,000 a year, right? So my point is it's limited access area. What entrepreneur is going to place their store in 1,000 people population? Pretty much not going to happen. So we have an ability to capture, new revenue streams. Now the city of North Bonneville is not dependent on passing a local bond, right? They don't need to get a loan from a bank. This also could stem into a new revenue stream that could flow into a state bank as well. So this is also on my platform. I would like to see my entire county and the entire state at large and nation, if you will, every area be available to access medical cannabis primarily. So just like to throw that out there as well.
Right, it's beautiful. So what we're gonna have you do now is, again, state your name, the office you're running for, you know, a good little spiel, what you know, little chunks. So if we cut it up, people can kind of get the gist of you, what you're about, where they can find you, website, and then what they can do to help volunteer.
For sure. Thank you. Well, first off, I would like to thank the Washington State Berniecrats, every Berniecrat out there, for maintaining the energy that it takes to bring a community together and to implement the change that we all were inspired around. So thank you for allowing me to come on and answer these questions. So my name's Jed Haney. I'm running for Thurston County Commissioner, District 3. You can find out information about me at voteforjed.com. There's also a volunteer portal there. You can fill out the document and we'll receive that. We need help with all sorts of things, from phone banking, doorbelling. Some volunteer activity is always great. About me, I am really short. I'm a 4th generation Washingtonian that loves Washington and would love to see Washington thrive and really expand our foothold as far as a democratically driven state. As far as that identity is nationally known. And so I would like to see that happen. I mentioned in my interview that I really believe in local politics, and that's one of the reasons that I'm running. On my platform, I have progressive public safety policy reform. I have environmental management and economic stewardship. And some of those things might sound centrist or Republican, but I think that that's where we all actually agree, is that if our communities were stronger, we would be stronger and we wouldn't have these issues. So the way I come about it is through public ownership and through engaging every individual in our county to inspire them to get involved in the local politics, because this is where your voice matters. So, you know, again, you can find out information about me at voteforjed.com. There's a little bio. I've been active in the community for 4 years, primarily the cannabis community as an active member. I was given the Dope Magazine Cannabis Activist Award last year. It was kind of a nice little feather in my cap. It was a nice moment, though, to see that a whole community comes together and acknowledges you for your work. So I'm coming out of my era of being a frontline activist for cannabis rights. I'm still very active, but I've decided to throw my hat in the ring. And I think that I would hope to inspire others to do the same, because that's what it's going to take to change the dynamic. So be the change that you see, and get involved with a local campaign that helps, give you a voice. And if there is not one, then run.
What a great ending message. I started talking before I unmuted myself. Thank you so very much for joining us today, Jed, and thank you everybody out there for watching. We will put this video in our group and vote on whether you're a Berniecrat or not. I don't see anything telling me that you won't make that through. So, and we'll let you know as soon as that voting time ends, and get you going out here. Again, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Okay, live stream is done.